Our New Testament lesson this morning is a hard one for a lot of people to hear because it describes the early church as a community where people gave away all their stuff, where they claimed individual ownership of nothing and held everything in common. I think when most folks hear that, they cringe just a little bit. Suddenly being without your stuff probably sounds kind of scary, especially here just a few days after Halloween. We like our stuff, our cars and our clothes and our smartphones and all kinds of technological gadgets. If being a part of the Church of Jesus Christ means giving up our stuff, most of us will have serious second thoughts about whether we really want to be disciples or not. A fun game to play on a long car ride is to ask everyone, if you had to leave home suddenly and could only take one thing with you, what would it be? I remember being given that question as part of a fourth grade class assignment. A hurricane is coming, we were told, and you have to evacuate immediately. You can only take one thing with you. What is it? As we went around the room, other kids in my class said things like food, water, a radio, a parent, practical things that you would need in an emergency. When it came to be my turn, though, I named a treasured stuffed dog that had been given to me when I was 3. Looking back, it does seem a little silly and impractical, but that dog was the most important thing I owned, and I'll be darned if I was going to flee before impending meteorological doom without it. Now, we were taught from an early age in my family that stuff is important and it has to be taken care of. Don't throw your clothes on the floor. Put your books away on the shelf. I didn't buy you that video game so you could lend it to the kid down the street. Stuff wasn't plentiful in my family, so when you got something, you took care of it. And when you couldn't use it for its intended purpose any longer, you didn't throw it away, you found a new purpose for it. Butter dishes became food storage dishes. My father's old t-shirts became dish towels. My sister's old non-gender specific clothes became my clothes. Anything not reusable was sent to Goodwill. We weren't allowed to just throw away perfectly good stuff. Some of you may remember the famous stand-up comic George Carlin, who used to talk a lot about stuff and how much stuff people own. He said if you didn't have so much stuff, you wouldn't even need a house. You could just walk around all the time. And when you leave your house, you got to lock it up. Wouldn't want somebody to come by and take some of your stuff. That's what your house is, a place to keep your stuff while you go out and get more stuff. But we actually have so much stuff that we don't even have room for it in our homes anymore. According to the Self-Storage Association fact sheet, there is currently about 2.3 billion square feet of rentable storage space in the United States. Taken all together, that's more than 78 square miles of covered rentable storage space. That's an area more than 3 times the size of Manhattan, which breaks down to a little over 7 square feet of storage space for every man, woman, and child in the United States. Now remember, that's not living space, that's storage space. That's just extra space for extra stuff that we can't fit into our homes. And according to that same fact sheet, more than 85% of that space had stuff in it during the first quarter of this year. We have so much stuff, we are actually in danger of running out of space to store it all. And we have all kinds of stuff. We have labor-saving stuff like dishwashers and lawnmowers. We have valuable stuff like grandma's pearls. We have sentimental stuff like our kids' first drawings and boxes and books filled with old pictures of friends and family from long ago. We have practical stuff like the second TV for the kids so Dad can watch his football game in peace. We have necessary stuff like food and warm clothes and snow shovels. We have useless stuff like Snuggies and Thigh Masters and almost anything else bought on an infomercial. And we have stuff we keep just because we can't throw it away. Broken stuff we're hoping to fix, and clothes that don't fit anymore, but we're hoping to keep just in case we lose weight. But no matter what you say about it, it's still your stuff. You earned it. You deserve it. It belongs to you. To suggest otherwise is practically un-American. The right to own stuff is a foundational value in this country. Whether it's an exotic pet like an African elephant or a gun powerful enough to bring one down, we reserve the right to own whatever our hearts desire in whatever quantities we can afford. And if you don't believe me, just check out the auction website eBay sometime. In 2004, someone paid $28,000 for a grilled cheese sandwich that appeared to bear the image of the Virgin Mary. That is true. In March of 2000, 19-year-old Kathy Summers paid over $1,000 for 2 pieces of French toast that had been left uneaten by famous singer and actor Justin Timberlake. And in 2005, an anonymous buyer paid just over $450,000 for the original iconic Hollywood sign. These are all true. Which raises the question, do we have an unhealthy relationship with stuff? Internet entrepreneur Paul Graham has written on his blog that Americans have too much stuff, and that's a problem. The worth of something, he writes, isn't the price, it's the value that you get from it. The only way you're ever going to extract any value from your stuff is to use it. And if you don't have any immediate use for it, you probably never will. And once you've accumulated a certain amount of stuff, it becomes a burden to keep up with, until at some point you don't own your stuff anymore. Your stuff owns you. Maybe that's why it was so important for the early church to be rid of their stuff. Luke describes the early church in Acts 4 as a community that is of the same heart and soul. They have chosen to hold everything in common, and no one is in need, because if they owned lands or houses, they sold them and distributed the money to those who needed it. That's a ridiculously radical vision of community that I doubt very many people would embrace today. In fact, I feel reasonably sure that a fair number of Christians would label such a notion communist. Now, if it seems hard to believe that a community could all be of the same heart and soul and could actually throw all their stuff into a common pot, that's because it is hard to believe. And the events that occur later in Acts suggest that if it actually did happen, it didn't last for very long. Just 2 chapters later, we learn that something is wrong because the widows are not being fed anymore. And later in Acts, we find evidence of doctrinal divisions. But what is important here is the value of the memory. Luke is writing in a time in the church's history, or writing of a time in the church's history, when everyone was a part of a team and when no one was out for him or herself. That's the virtue that Luke is advocating here. Everyone has a gift. Everyone has a role. Everyone must play their part if the church is to be what the church was intended from its beginning to be. Luke writes about stuff, but throwing their stuff into a common pot for the good of all was a sign that they were all in this together. You see, in the middle of this story, there is a line that explains this. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. The gathered community of believers had witnessed Jesus give his life as a sacrifice for many. They had seen, many of them with their own eyes, the depth and breadth of God's power and love for them expressed in the life, death, and resurrection of this man, Jesus of Nazareth. How then could they put more value on their own stuff than Jesus had put on his own life? If he could give his life for them, then they could give their lives and their livelihoods for each other. And while no one is asking us to give up all of our stuff today, we would do well to ask ourselves why that's such a tough concept to embrace. The notion of inalienable property rights is a legal construct and was not necessarily a value that Jesus either held or taught. Malcolm Forbes, publisher of Forbes magazine and well-known proponent of extravagant spending, once famously said, "He who dies with the most toys wins." But by contrast, Jesus told a rich man to sell all that he owned and give the money to the poor, and then follow me. For Jesus, stuff was a means to an end, not an end in itself. Stuff was valuable when it met human need. Stuff was meant to be used to improve life for everyone, not just the individual. We see this sentiment in our Old Testament lesson this morning, where God instructs the Israelites that if they harvest a field and find that they've left something behind, they are not to go back for it. These extras are to be left for those who have no fields and no real way to provide food for themselves, the widow and the orphan and the alien. It is the same with olive groves and grape vineyards. The fruits are to be harvested, but a second pass is not to be made. What you didn't get the first time is to be left for the poor to glean, which may very well offend our sense of fair play. If it's my field and my crop that I planted, tended, and protected from weeds and pests, then the produce of that field belongs to me. Yet what Jesus teaches and what Luke's description of the early church reflects is the understanding that all that we are and all that we have come from God. God's intention is that it be shared. It seems hard to believe that God intends for some of us to know great abundance while others starve. Again, I'm not calling for us to disavow capitalism or for you to go out today and sell or give away all your stuff. Frankly, I don't want to come into work tomorrow and find piles of your stuff in our parking lot. But what I am saying is that there's an important principle here that defines what it is to be the church. Our stuff is not really ours. It is God's. And we honor God when we use the gifts God has given us for the ministry to which God has called us. As William Barclay has written, the best way to use sacred things is to use them to help one another. Now, I'm going to tell you a story, and I feel certain I've told it before, but I ask that you just humor me. It seems that there was once a village where everyone pretty much kept to themselves. They grew their own food and tended to their own business. When someone was in need, they were pretty much on their own. One day, a stranger happened to be passing through the town. He was interested to find none of the usual hustle and bustle of the town square. He was hungry. He had nothing to eat, so he sat down, built a small fire, and began heating a pot of water over it. In the pot, he placed a large, round stone. Shortly, one of the townsfolk came by and asked what he was up to. "Well, I'm making stone soup," said the stranger. "Is it good?" asked the townsperson rather skeptically. "It is, but it would be better with some onions." "You know, I grow onions in my garden," said the man. "I'd be willing to trade you some for a chance to taste soup made from a stone." The stranger agreed, so the man hurried off to get his onions. Soon a woman walked by and noticed the pot and asked, "What are you making?" "Stone soup," said the traveler. "Would you like to try some when it's finished?" "I have never had soup made from a stone," said the woman. "Is it any good?" "It is, but you know what? It could definitely be better if it had some carrots." "I have some carrots, and I would gladly share some in exchange for some of that soup when it's done." And so she hurried off to fetch her carrots. And so it went. The stranger stirring his pot as individuals wandered over to investigate, and hearing that he was creating a masterful stew from only a stone, they were eager to try it. And finding that it lacked only some small bit of celery or a few potatoes or some salt or meat, the townsfolk were eager to provide just the ingredient in exchange for the promise of this exotic soup made only from a stone. And when it was done, the entire village had gathered around the pot, talking about this strange man and his stone soup, and eagerly awaiting the meal. And the stranger ladled out this meaty stew of vegetables and potatoes and spices to all the people of the village and to himself, and all were filled with the goodness of one another's gardens and pantries, and all were enriched by the warmth of one another's company. And when the meal was done, the stranger took his pot and his stone and wandered on down the road. You see, God has blessed us with so much, with gifts and abilities and stuff. And when we keep those blessings only for ourselves, they are just that, stuff. But when we share them with one another for the purposes of God's kingdom, they become something else, sacred. To God be all glory, honor, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come. Amen.